Today we're joined by Julia Tourianski, who's a self-described anarchist whose goal is to influence the denial of assumed power structures. She's a centerpiece of Brave the World, a popular YouTube channel covering anarchy and other exits from the system. Welcome to the show, Julia.
Thanks for having me.
So, all right, tell us what exactly is Brave the World?
You summed it up pretty well. It's just anything that I find worthwhile exploring and delving into, and sometimes standing up in the name of or against. So, I don't know. In the past, I've attended like CPAC and have asked very anarchistic questions. That was fun. That was one of my first projects. I did the protests at Bilderberg. I've been following the Silk Road case and doing some, I guess, reporting, but more, I don't like to use the word reporting because I think journalists are blood-sucking scum. It's more of a moral support and ethical support in the name of free speech. So, yeah, I mean, I could go on, but I think that's good enough.
So, Julia, where does the name Brave the World come from? Does it have an origin that means something to you?
Yeah, so everyone knows Brave New World, right? So instead of a brave new world, instead of embracing a brave new world, we should brave the world and go in the opposite direction.
Very cool. And I actually had a question about what you were speaking on a few moments ago, and it had to do with your protesting Bilderberg and also your hatred of journalists, because I think that there are awesome journalists and poor journalists like anything else. So why is it that it took journalists so long to even figure out that Bilderberg is a thing?
Because, well, this is the kind of stages of the status quo that we get fed. So what you have first is complete denial, right? They deny that something's happened completely. Once that becomes harder to do, they label you as conspiracy theorists and say, oh, it's an over-dramatization. Once that becomes apparent that it's not true again, they accept that the reality, and they accept that we know the reality, but they normalize it. So Bilderberg, oh, it's no big deal. It's just a meeting of powerful people and families and politicians and those companies that are in charge of manufacturing arms, meeting with potential presidents. No big deal. Oh, and nobody ever really knows when and where, and the list is secret, and they block off entire public streets and roads, but it's no big deal. Oh, and your taxes pay for it. No big deal. And your taxes also pay for their security. I believe the Copenhagen one cost over 100,000 euros just for security. And when I was there, I actually vined an endless stream of high protection armored vehicles coming in and out of Bilderberg, the hotel that they were doing it at. So,
You still with us, Julia?
uh-huh.
Okay, cool. It sounded like you trailed off there for a second.
Yeah, I don't remember the question now. I went on a tangent.
No,
I may have answered it.
Bilderberg tends to get anyone going on a tangent, myself included. So it's a fascinating thing.
Right.
And
journalists.
Yes.
Right. So again, and journalism has taken, like, I've been saying this for a little while now. Journalism used to be a profession where it was okay to have a bias and an opinion. It was, in fact, encouraged. Now, to have a bias or an opinion is wrong. That's bad journalism. But the very fact that we deny that there's always a bias and then there's always an opinion when a journalist writes is more dishonest than having an outright bias. So when you have something like a very obvious conflict and you give both sides of the story, even though one is obviously in the wrong, I think that's morally reprehensible, and I think that it's dishonest because you're giving the same weight to something that might not deserve the same weight. So the entire concept of journalism has been bastardized to me, and I hate when I'm called a journalist. And even the journalists that are independent and in the libertarian and anarchist communities, I've learned to disrespect a lot of them as well, because I've personally experienced some very dishonest activity.
So that's really interesting. There's behind, let's say, the Bilderbergs, right? There's like this core philosophy that it seems like you've sort of centered a lot of your work around. Could you describe for our listeners sort of what is it about, you know, bad actors in journalism, bad actors at the Bilderberg system that you're really getting at here philosophically?
Well, what I understand, having a kind of motivational factor of gain, right? So, but it's become the sole purpose of people being a journalist. So you get even people that are supposed to be more morally honest and doing good, like people in the libertarian movement, that is the standard they claim to be on, you know, non-aggression, you know, they're not profit, but I keep seeing people solely focusing on clickbait. And recently something happened where there was a private letter that Ross Ulbricht sent to a very popular libertarian radio show, to an individual from that show, saying thanks for supporting me, blah, blah, blah. And he said a few private things in the letter which were meant to be private. And they went and published it as a headline saying, "A first public letter from Ross Ulbricht." That is incredibly inappropriate, and the things that were in the letter actually had the potential of hurting him because of the position he's in. His lawyers were very worried, and his mother asked the people directly to take it down, and they wouldn't take it down until Ross spent his call quota and his own money, which he has almost none left, to call them and ask them to take it down. So I'm seeing this dishonesty in the name of profit, even in our own community. And Ross has written, they are not the first people to get a letter from Ross. I know many people that have gotten letters from Ross, and they did not go ahead and publish it. I did not publish my letters on my blog from Ross because I assumed that they're private.
You know, and I think that the main word there is assume when it comes to that, and it's really interesting when it comes to private communication as what is private and what is public, and it really comes down to what you make private and what you make public, and I'm probably the oddest one of the whole decentralized group here, because I have not made I haven't taken a stance on the Ross situation, because I think obviously what he did is, you know, the freedom part of me says, oh, who cares, it's to each his own, but then the other part of me goes, well, when you play with fire and you get burned, and then you see that he got life in prison, and I as a taxpayer have to pay for that, that is what bothers me actually the most. So I'm actually, you know, very interested in that more than anything else is the sentence.
Well, you should be upset with the state for having to pay those taxes, not with Ross, right?
Absolutely, and that's, yeah, it's absolutely, and the judge.
And I mean, the whole, I've had 2 interviews before this too, and there's one thing I just keep reiterating. The whole thing of whether Ross is guilty or not, and there's been a lot of finger pointing at his supporters saying that we've been inconsistent. One minute he's not DPR, the next minute he's is DPR, but go anti-drug war. We have not changed our tune. His supporters maintain that he's innocent, and let me explain what we mean by innocent. If Ross is DPR the whole time, started it throughout, the only person who was DPR, if he was DPR some of the time, and multiple DPRs are involved, if he wasn't DPR at all, all of those make him still innocent, because at the end of the day, the Silk Road reduced harm, saved lives, and took violence off the streets. That is not even negotiable. So in an ethical sense, he is innocent. In the law sense, he's guilty. But you know, so are people in that follow the Muslim religion and are under Muslim law that drink breast milk on the third full moon of the year. They're guilty to be punishable by death. So I mean, if you're guilty by law, anything could be made illegal, right?
This whole trial situation and sentencing with Ross really has me sick to my stomach, and it's been pretty upsetting for a lot of people, I'm sure. I understand you were at the trial. Were you also present at the sentencing? And can you tell us a little bit about your experience with either of those?
Yeah, I was at the trial, and if anybody wants to just get up to date with how it went down, I have like very thorough videos on my channel, and it's Brave the World channel on YouTube. You can just search it; it's easy. Or my website, bravetheworld.com. But yeah, the trial itself was daunting. They really dragged it out. The prosecution was very brutal, and they pandered to their audience, which was a jury of his peers, which was not, because they were all, most of them were government workers and very basic people. Not to be rude, but a jury of his peers would be at least university graduates, at least people that are somewhat technologically savvy, at least people that are under 40 years old. So it was not a jury of his peers. So the entire process was pretty horrific, and again, the behavior from journalists was incredibly inappropriate. I was misquoted, Lynn was misquoted, and then the same people who misquote us for their clicks come to our faces and say, "Oh, can I get another interview with you?" So, I mean, that was not a fun time. I did get a flight to go see him during the sentencing, but then the sentencing changed after I already booked my flight, and I just didn't have the means to change it back, and I decided to go home instead.
So one of the things you talked about a little bit earlier was this idea that things can be against the law by the state or by a central authority, but still morally correct, right? Or morally, or the inverse. Things can be morally wrong and still perfectly legal. One of the things I think you pursued, a lot of people pursued very early on in sort of the trial, was this idea of jury nullification, where if the jury feels that the law itself is unjust, they can, you know, not convict the person of the court. They can actually basically nullify that law for that sentence.
Yeah. And that's a constitutional right. But the judge, right before the jury went to deliberate, she actually said, even if you don't agree with the law, you still have to judge according to the law. So she was alluding to the fact that jury nullification exists. She knew that most of those people are uninformed, but she still took the precaution to dismiss any, you know, cloudiness in their mind in case they were leaning in that direction. So she was very adamant about being against the concept of jury nullification. The law's the law, and, you know, he did this, this, and this, therefore he broke this, this, and that law, therefore he's guilty. Morality, or, you know, that did not counter in at all.
Yeah, it was kind of tragic, and now it's kind of an inverse state where the state is the one committing the violence against a morally innocent individual, right? And that's sort of the travesty of it all. What is the role? Go ahead.
Just playing on the. He's a non-violent criminal. Okay,
Exactly.
He's a criminal by the law. He's a non-violent criminal with no history, and he's going to be sent to a maximum security prison for life with rapists and sociopaths and murderers. Like, that is a complete infringement on any kind of human rights, even by the most basic standards.
Well, and what's interesting is in the community, you know, everybody feels that he largely helped to remove violence from the system. So what do you think is the role? What can we gain from this, and what can we do today, first and foremost? And then what can we do to make sure that things like this absurdity doesn't ever happen again?
Jeffrey Tucker wrote a cool article, and he named Ross Ulbricht the Socrates of today, and he named all of these historic characters that were prosecuted for being, you know, a trailblazer and making like a watershed in history because of their achievement. And then we look back on it and we're like, oh, we probably shouldn't have punished them for doing what they did. And he's being very positive, and he hopes that'll be the case. I would love to believe that, but I see where America's moving, what direction it's moving in, and I think it's just becoming more morally bankrupt. And I think people, a lot of these people who are anti-Silk Road or anti-Ross, a lot of them are like these liberal atheists, right? And liberal atheists pride themselves on not needing a god or a higher power, right? They pride themselves on thinking for themselves. Yet, they're actually replacing the belief in God. And originally, Christianity was very anarchistic, and Christians were prosecuted for not worshiping the state in Rome. And if you read anything that Jesus said, he was a total anarchist and anti-authoritarian and pro-peace and non-violence. And these very same people just replace religion with the worship for the state, which is a million times worse. And then they think that they're these progressive, forward-thinking individuals. And a lot of them should be anti-drug war, right? And a lot of them are anti-drug war. But no, it doesn't count for the Silk Road, because Ross made a profit, and profit is evil because they're all socialists. So somehow, because Ross made a profit from the Silk Road, negates any good that the Silk Road did.
Exactly.
And as a follow-up, something you said a moment ago too, when you were talking about the sentencing and just how he was sentenced with murderers, rapists, violent criminals. I think that actually is something more than being morally bankrupt, is really the prison industrial complex, as people like to call it, and there's a profit incentive there. And how do you feel about that? Do you feel this is something that's isolated with Ross, or do you feel this is something that is a bigger problem?
Well, specific to Ross, he's being crucified to set an example. That's all. Like, I knew he was gonna get life. I didn't want to say, like, I tried to have hope before it's completely, in stone, and I still have hope for the appeal process, because on paper there is like so many brass hooks to hang an appeal on. But I think he was made an example of, and I think Judge Forrest's only job, because of her influence from Chuck Schumer, was to make an example of him. And that's just the sad circumstance of his existence. He was the first, and he's going to be adequately punished, and everyone's going to know, and there's going to be a media campaign against him, and they're going to slander him to the point of labeling him as a murderer, whether or not it was proven. There wasn't even bodies, and the site was ran by their own feds at that point, and it's quite obvious that they faked it by now.
Yeah, what I found so surreal was the difference in sentencing, right? So he's not only being 2 life sentences and I think an additional like 40 or 50 years, but he's also being held accountable for the entirety of the gross revenue of the platform. So for all of the dealers on the platform, he now owes a perpetual debt to the state to pay the state, not even victims, not even like there were no victims. It was a victimless crime. Not even to go to like drug prevention, right?
Well, the government's a mafia, and he went and became independent, and they want their cut. That's all. They want their cut, and they're going to get it. And I think part of it too is they just always wanted their cut, and the only way to get it is to crucify Ross. I mean, you want to talk about the evils of money and profit? Government #1.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about is this a Western phenomenon? Is this limited to America? Is this limited to Western states, or is this more of a global concern?
What do you mean by this? Like the perversion of the justice?
The violent aggression of the state against its citizens.
I think America is one of the newer countries to do this. Like, America used to be quite a free, independent, moral country, honor thy neighbor. Like, America was very, you know, there's a reason why it prospered so fast, because it was so free market and non-aggressive, and, you know, obviously they had the revolutions and the slavery, but the people's individual moral compass was quite strong, and you can't forget that the slavery went hand in hand with the state, right? As you know, there's so many complex issues, but generally America, compared to the history of a lot of countries, America's a new country, was okay, and now it's like the worst of them all, obviously. But yeah, of course, as long as humans have existed, there have been states, and as long as states have existed, they have been violent. Look at Russia, look at China, you know, look at Latin America. It's conquest and you know, conquer, and look at England. Look at the history of England, and they're, you know, in terms of police state and ridiculous laws, they almost outdo America.
It seems what's so compelling about Ross is that he's so much the opposite of that. I mean, even just looking at his persona publicly, his LinkedIn profile is still alive. You can look at it now and see, you know, he wanted to make the world a freer place by giving people the opportunity to be free. I mean, that's very close to like what I hold as my ideal. So it's very hard to see someone like this, as you say, really being crucified. And I know you've been working very closely obviously with his mother, Lynn, who's been obviously spreading this word and trying to free your son. What can maybe listeners who feel the same way do to support the family, to support the legal fund, whether monetarily or just through words of support?
freeross.org, please donate, because the appeal process takes a year or more, and it's costing her a lot for the lawyer fees. Like, it's really, really expensive. Remember, the state has all the money in the world, and they do not. I'm doing a little project that people will still have time to contribute to if they like. I probably won't send it off till Friday, but I'm compiling a like a care package for him of screenshots of all the nice and supportive comments and articles that I've seen in his favor, you know, across the last few days. Because, you know, imagine being in this vacuum. Like, look, like, how often do you guys go on Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media you go on, like, a day, to like just to like reassure yourself that you exist, and, you know, to have your social connections and to feel in contact with the world? Ross hasn't gotten to do that in, you know, over a year. And when there's a media brigade outside and he knows that he's being talked about and he can literally feel it, I mean, that must be a horrible feeling, to be so cut off from the world. So I want to give him a glimpse into how much support he's been getting.
That's really awesome, and we really appreciate, you know, what you're doing to sort of get the word out, and not only with the Ross Ulbricht case, but with things like the Bit license and elsewhere. And we sort of like to talk about a few of the other projects you're working on.
Sure. Just before,
yeah.
Like, if anybody wants to add a comment or like their experience, or I've been getting some experiences from people who bought pharmaceutical drugs that weren't available in America and have like saved their families' lives and reduced suffering. They're like really heartbreaking stories. So if anybody has anything like that, just tweet it at me at Brave the World, or like, I mean, I know there's a comment section there, and you can link my website. They can email me through my website as well.
Well, we should include that link in our show notes. We definitely encourage anyone interested to do that. So we did kind of want to ask you, sort of going back and circling back around, how you really began all this activism in the first place. I know you sort of began with your first video at CPAC, probably about 2 years ago, I'm guessing. But sort of how did it come to this point for you? Now you're very much involved in a lot of these very high-profile cases. What attracted you to filmmaking and sort of drove you to take this style you do?
So I had my Brave the World Twitter account like for 6 months prior to doing anything on YouTube. And I would write for Mises Canada sparsely and go to the meetings. And I just got, people don't really read articles unless like you get lucky and it goes really viral, or unless you're an amazing writer. And, you know, I'm decent, I'm not, you know, that great. So just like, I felt that I could reach people in a different way. And then I helped organize Liberty Now in Toronto, and I met some really cool people while I was there. And you know, I almost, one of them who like I greatly, you know, I thought he accomplished quite a lot for his age, said something to me that I don't think he even meant to like encourage me or anything, but he said something so flippantly and matter-of-factly, like, oh, well, why don't you just do this? Like, it felt like I could just do that. Why not? And I had been thinking about it anyways. So I actually, at that point, already had my first script, which was my first video, which was a pro-gun video, and it's under a minute long, and it went really big. So I got really lucky with that because my first video that had me in it went really big. Prior to that, I had 2 videos that are like compilation videos, which I still really love. So if you get a chance to check out like my first 2 videos, that'd be really fun. But yeah, so that's how I did it. And you know, I had a little bit of experience when I was like 16, 17 on YouTube. I was part of anyone a gamer here? Anyone played Half-Life? Yeah, so I was in the Escape for City 17 short video that was based on the Half-Life universe, and that went viral. It was the #1 video in all of North America for a week straight on YouTube. And so that almost like took my fear away from being online and on camera. So I guess all of those things combined, and here I am.
That's awesome. It's always fun, like hearing people's backstories and like how they just have discovered these things. So moving into like some sort of defense mechanisms, right? So there's a lot of listeners out there who are aiming at solving problems, like Ross was, like some of the things that you talk about, right? What are some of the things we can do to protect ourselves moving forward to make sure that we don't succumb to the violence of the state?
Well, I think art is not only a reflection of culture, it's a driver of culture. So that's very important. Technology is a very literal reaction to our environment and also driver into our future, which I'll leave it up to guys like you. You know, please use some decentralized innovations to, you know, change the power structures of our future. That'd be awesome. I'll just keep being loud and promote things. You guys can actually do the hard work. So I mean, those 2 things in combination, you know, the art form plus the literal and technical, I think they can't exist to their full impact without each other. And you know, art, when I say art, that includes you know, writing and ideas and awareness, as much as I hate that term, but you know, in the spreading of information that's not just dictated by our assumed power structures.
So Julia, you also mentioned wanting to discuss a recent video of yours, and sort of as we wrap up the show here, maybe we can preview a little bit of what you're working on for our listeners. You recently made a video about Rojava, which is an autonomous region in northern Syria, Kurdistan, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what attracted your interest to it?
Yeah, for sure. I'm part of the Unsystem mailing list, and there's been, you know, people link things and talk about things a lot, and we were talking about Rojava for maybe like 6 months now, and people were sharing links and all this, and I just got into it and I looked at it, and you know, it's, you know, everyone always says, oh, give me an example of anarchism that works, haha, and it's hard unless you look back in history, right? But there it is. It's a very interesting combination of communalism, anarchism, and direct democracy. They have no state, they have no tax, they have very local, it's not governments, they have like local administrations for every street. So you can go, it's very, very local based. So any conflict you resolve with your neighbors first, and then it's delegated up. And you know, at the top you have people, again, for every area, and it's 3 people, and each one of them has to be from a different ethnic background, and one of them at least has to be a female. So it's like very, very democratic in that sense, because the representation isn't skewed in any way. And for that region, it's very important, because think of where this is happening. This is in the border of Turkey and Syria during a Islamic State attack, and these people are completely equal in gender and ethnicity and creed and religion and all of these things. It's insane for this area, right? And they're living peacefully amongst themselves, and they're the only boots on the ground against ISIS. And what is NATO doing? Nothing. They're not supporting them with aid. They're not giving them weapons. They're doing absolutely nothing because Turkey has labeled them as terrorists, because Turkey has a history of oppressing the Kurdish people to the point of not even giving them the recognition of a culture and not letting them have education in their own language or even naming their kids as, you know, after Kurdish names. So this is the petty crap that we're dealing with. Meanwhile, these people, there's like 2 million of them. It's 3 cantons. It's Rojava altogether, but it's 3 separate cantons that, you know, they go in between. They're actually, it's a complete feat in political and socio-economic organization.
Okay, Julia, it seems like you're a total faucet of knowledge and wisdom and insight into the things that are going on here. Can you tell us where can people find more of you? Share your YouTube channel, your Twitter. What are those links, and where can people find you?
BraveTheWorld.com, and from there you can find everything else that's me. Twitter is at BraveTheWorld. YouTube channel, Brave the World channel. And what else? Facebook, I have a Facebook page. You can just search Brave the World on there. Yeah. Follow,
okay,
support.
Great.
If you're very rich, donate a little. If you're not very rich, you know, leave me a nice comment.
I especially liked your comment about how people, more than technical people, can contribute to the ecosystem. What you're doing, you're shouting from the hilltops and sharing and spreading information. And that, in my opinion, that is just as equivalent to the technology side of things. They have to, both things and more need to exist altogether for this to be successful. So Julia, thank you so much for your time today. Our listeners have very much enjoyed it. We've already got comments flowing in. So thanks again, Julia, for joining us.
You're welcome. See theorists and say, oh, it's an over-dramatization. Once that becomes, apparent that it's not true again, they accept that the reality, and they accept that we know the reality, but they normalize it. So Bilderberg, oh, it's no big deal. It's just a meeting of powerful people and families and politicians and those companies that are in charge of manufacturing arms, meeting with potential presidents. No big deal. Oh, and nobody ever really knows when and where, and the list is secret, and they block off entire public streets and roads, but it's no big deal. Oh, and your taxes pay for it. No big deal. And your taxes also pay for their security. I believe the Copenhagen one cost over 100,000 euros just for security. And when I was there, I actually vined an endless stream of, so when you have something like a very obvious conflict and you give both sides of the story, even though one is obviously in the wrong, I think that's morally reprehensible, and I think that it's dishonest because you're giving the same weight to something that might not deserve the same weight. So the entire concept of journalism has been bastardized to me, and I hate when I'm called a journalist. And even the journalists that are independent and in the libertarian and anarchist communities, I've learned to disrespect a lot of them as well because I've personally experienced some very dishonest activity.
So that's really interesting. There's behind, let's say, the Bilderbergs, right? There's like this core philosophy that it seems like you've sort of centered a lot of your work around. Could you describe for our listeners sort of what is it about, bad actors in journalism, bad actors at the Bilderberg system that you're really getting at here philosophically?
Well, what I understand, high high protection armored vehicles coming in and out of Bilderberg, the hotel that they were doing it at. So.
You still with us, Julia?
Uh-huh.
Okay, cool. It sounded like you trailed off there for a second.
Yeah, I don't remember the question now. I went on a tangent.
No,
I may have answered it.
Bilderberg tends to get anyone going on a tangent, myself included. So it's a fascinating thing.
Right,
and
journalists.
Yes.
Right. So again, and journalism has taken, like, I've been saying this for a little while now. Journalism used to be a profession where it was okay to have a bias and an opinion. It was, in fact, encouraged. Now, to have a bias or an opinion is wrong. That's bad journalism. But the very fact that we deny that there's always a bias and then there's always an opinion when a journalist writes is more dishonest than having an outright bias. So
today we're joined by Julia Tourianski, who's a self-described anarchist whose goal is to influence the denial of assumed power structures. She's a centerpiece of Brave the World, a popular YouTube channel covering anarchy and other exits from the system. Welcome to the show, Julia.
Thanks for having me.
So, all right, tell us what exactly is Brave the World?
You summed it up pretty well. It's just anything that I find worthwhile exploring and delving into, and sometimes standing up in the name of or against. So I don't know. In the past, I've attended like CPAC and have asked very anarchistic questions. That was fun. That was one of my first projects. I did the protests at Bilderberg. I've been following the Silk Road case and doing some, I guess, reporting, but more. I don't like to use the word reporting because I think journalists are blood-sucking scum. It's more of a moral support and ethical support in the name of free speech. So yeah, I mean, I could go on, but I think that's good enough.
So Julia, where does the name Brave the World come from? Does it have an origin that means something to you?
Yeah, so everyone knows Brave New World, right? So instead of a brave new world, instead of embracing a brave new world, we should brave the world and go in the opposite direction.
Very cool. And I actually had a question about what you were speaking on a few moments ago, and it had to do with your protesting Bilderberg and also your hatred of journalists, because I think that there are awesome journalists and poor journalists like anything else. So why is it that it took journalists so long to even figure out that Bilderberg is a thing?
Because, well, this is the kind of stages of the status quo that we get fed. So what you have first is complete denial, right? They deny that something's happened completely. Once that becomes harder to do, they label you as conspiracy